Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 11th of March. I'm Maeve McMahon and you're watching Europe Today, your daily dose of European news and analysis, live here on Euronews. Coming up, as the war in Iran enters its 12th day, European leaders are growing increasingly exasperated. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says he's becoming deeply concerned about what he calls an apparent lack of strategy from the United States and Israel. He said that he has said he's no interest in a, quote, endless war. And while you were sleeping, tensions in the Middle East escalated with heavy strikes hitting Iran, Lebanon and the Gulf states. Civilian casualties are rising, and in Lebanon, thousands of people have already been displaced. The US says it's destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels after Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth warned that the most intense day of US strikes on Iran was yet to come. For more on the ongoing war and Europe's reactions, we're joined here in the studio by our EU News editor, Maria Tadeo. Good morning, Maria. So a lot to process this morning. Fill us in.
Well, a lot to process because this is still a story, obviously, about war in the region and energy, which is critical, of course, for the global economy. And once again is the spotlight on the Strait of Hormuz and oil. And of course, there are now concerns, increasing concerns, that this is an area that now Iran will target with mines. And obviously that means that transportation and the flows of oil, which need to come out of the Strait, also coming out of the Gulf of Persia too, could be impacted even more severely. And this is one of the most critical locations when it comes to the global energy market. This is why we're seeing this whiplash and energy prices up and down on any news related to the ability to get oil out of the region. Now, on that note, yesterday, President Trump issued a warning in a post on social media in which he said if the mines, for some reason are placed and they are not removed forthwith, so immediately, the military consequences to Iran will be, quote, at a level never seen before. So obviously, that's the U.S. Responding again to reports that this is the next stage for Iran when it comes to the strategy of now escalation, but also chaos, with no signs that the regime or the new Ayatollah is willing to engage for the time being with the U.S. And the story, as I say, is critical and it really matters, not just because of the energy market, the implications for the economy, but also because it really speaks to the U.S. strategy. You alluded to the German Chancellor saying, we are confused. Is there a goalpost? Is there a goal? What is the goal? What is the strategy from the U.S.? And the thing about the energy market is that it never lies. You're either able to get the flow of oil up and running or you're not. And if you're not, and the escalation in the Strait of Hormuz continues to go up and you do see that tankers become blocked, not only this is going to have major repercussions in the market, but it also could show, and this is a fundamental point, that the U.S., alongside Israel, of course, has gone into a major military operation without all the details figured out. So this is a critical point at this stage.
And that's why Emmanuel Macron, he's hosting a G7 call today.
Yes, precisely. Of course, we've seen the G7 meet on the finance sphere with the ministers of finance, then, of course, the energy ministers who met yesterday. But today, this is a meeting that is going to take place at 3 p.m. Paris time. It is hosted by the French and Emmanuel Macron because the French hold the presidency. And, of course, President Trump is going to participate. Now, sources close to the Elysee say that the goal of this meeting is to take stock of the geoeconomic repercussions of this war, and in particular, when it comes to energy. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate around the idea of releasing strategic oil reserves to really deal with the issues in the energy market. Although I speak to many analysts who say the issue is not the stocking, really. The oil is there. The issue is the transportation and the impact on prices. And then to that extent, however, we also have to keep an eye today on the International Energy Agency because overnight reports that they could also release and make the biggest single day release of oil, even surpassing the 182 million barrels that they put out in 2022 when the war in Ukraine broke out, to deal with the implications and the ramifications in the energy market. But again, one of the fundamental questions beyond pricing and just logistics, is there a plan really to get oil coming out? And does the U.S. really have a strategy? And to more confusion, just briefly, yesterday, the U.S. Secretary for Energy said that they had managed to escort tankers out. Then he deleted it, and it was obvious that no tanker had been escorted out. So again, there's a lot of confusion, not just in the logistics, but really, is there a plan?
And of course, you had the opportunity to speak to the European Commissioner for Energy, Dan Jorgensen. He was in Strasbourg yesterday. We can take a look now at that interview, Maria.
This is, of course, a very serious situation. It is not as bad as in February 22 when Russia attacked Ukraine. At that time, we were more dependent on one single source of our energy, and it was fossil, it was gas from Russia. Now we are better situated to deal with the situation, but still, when the world market prices go up, it is a problem for us, which shows us one thing very clearly, that is, let's get rid of the dependency of fossil fuels. Let's have more homegrown, clean energy.
And of course, the G7 has been holding meetings. There's a lot of speculation about a release of strategic reserves. Is that something that you think would be helpful at this stage?
It is something that can become relevant. It would help keep the prices down. We are not in a situation where we have security of supply issues in Europe right now. But of course, the question of the prices are extremely important for our citizens and our industries. And we also need to be working in solidarity with our partners in the International Energy Agency network.
So is there going to be a release of these assets, or is it something that at this point there's consensus is a good idea, but not a date? What would trigger it?
That is too early to say. We are in the process of analyzing this, but of course it can happen.
And of course your job is to ensure energy security for the European Union. You say this is different to the Russian invasion, but there is a question of pricing. What measures in the short term can you put forward to deal with the escalation in prices?
Of course, there is a very clear concern for us that the prices are too high for our citizens and our industry. That's also why today we've put forward several different measures, both some that has the aim to help our long-term transition, but also some that can work short-term. For instance, we've sent a very clear signal to the member states of the Union. We recommend that you lower the taxes on electricity. That would make it easier for your industry to compete. It'll make it easier for your citizens to pay their bills, and it'll be good for the green transition. And you can do that tomorrow. It's not something where you have to wait for a new legislative proposal to be put forward for long negotiations and so forth. It can be done short term.
And is that the maximum that you contemplate, or is there more things that you could put on the table if the situation deteriorates?
There's definitely more things that can be put on the table. It's also very clear that there's a big difference between being in a serious situation like the one we're in now and being in an emergency like the one we had in 22. And since we're not there yet, we're not applying some of the emergency measures that we did in 22.
There has been calls now that leaders could ask, certainly next week when they meet and they talk about competitiveness, for another review of the ETS. Is that something that you would say, yes, everything can be reviewed?
We are, of course, continuously discussing what to do with regards to our long-term transition in the European Union, whilst at the same time addressing immediate needs. What's important for me to say is that our fundamental direction is the right one. We need to move away from fossils. We need to have a green transition. Why? Because it lowers prices, because it helps us decarbonize, but also because it gives us the energy security that we so clearly do not have right now. That's the lesson we learned from the situation in Ukraine when Russia attacked, but it's actually also a lesson that we're reminded now that other geopolitical events are affecting our price levels in Europe.
Of course, and you hear the industry saying the issue is that Europe does not have energy security. You cannot be competitive if you do not have energy security. Is that an exaggeration, or do you look at it and you say it's a fair point? At this point, Europe does not have that level of security.
No, unfortunately, it's very clear that we are not independent. We import for more than 370 billion euros fossils every year. That's not sustainable for our climate, certainly, but not for our economy either. We need to use more homegrown energy. The good news is that homegrown energy will also be cheaper than the fossil alternative. So not only will it help us to become more independent and therefore be good for our security, it'll also be good for our economy. Now, this is not something that might happen in the future and that we're waiting for. This is something that we are already doing. So last year, we deployed a record of 89 gigawatts of new renewables. That saved us more than 30 billion euros, just this newly deployed renewables. And this year, we will do the same. So we are moving in the right direction.
But when are you going to see that manifested in prices, however, especially given this volatility, because the direction of prices has been up, certainly for the past week?
The deployment of new renewables brings the prices down. This means that had we not had the renewables that we have, the prices would have been much higher. That's one of the reasons why we don't see the same effects now as we did in 22. So when prices are set for electricity, for instance, the most cheap energy bids first, and that's the renewables. Then sometimes if you don't have enough renewables in the system and it's the fossils that set the price, the gas that sets the price, that's when the prices go up. Also on the renewables. And the less hours, the better we can become at having less hours of the fossil setting the price, the better, of course, it is. So that's one of the reasons. I know it's a bit complicated, but that's one of the reasons why we are in a better situation now than we were in 22.
The Russian president has said that Russia is ready to intervene in this market to stabilize prices. When you hear that, what does that make you think? What does that allude to you?
We absolutely do not want Russian energy. Russia is conducting a terrible war on our friends in Ukraine, and we do not want to help indirectly finance that war by buying Russian energy. Russia has weaponized energy against us. Russia has blackmailed member states of the European Union using energy. So for us, we've said no more to this, and that is a standpoint that we will stick to.
Now, the war in Iran has spread to Lebanon, where Israel has vowed to root out the Iran-backed Shia militia Hezbollah. Thousands of people are on the move, mostly from South Lebanon, from a war that has already caused almost 600 deaths in the country. In a last-ditch effort to stop the violence, the Lebanese government asked for direct talks with Israel through a US intermediary. So far, the US and Israel have rebuffed the proposal, albeit not officially saying the government should focus on disarming Hezbollah. Yuroniews's senior editor and Middle East expert Sophie Claudet spoke to Lebanon's energy minister Joe Sadi. Here's what he had to say.
This was indeed a very courageous initiative by our president. But as of this time, I am not aware of any response yet.
But don't you think it's a little too late? As per the 2024 ceasefire agreement between Lebanon and Israel, the Lebanese government was supposed to disarm Hezbollah. This hasn't happened, and we've seen now what's happening.
Here, obviously, I think everybody would wish that the implementation of this would happen much quicker, but this has to do on one side with the availability of the capabilities of the Lebanese army. It has to do with also the behavior of Israel during that whole period.
But does the army have even the capabilities of disarming Hezbollah, which is a state within the states?
Based on what I'm no military expert, but based on what the army says, they do not have all the capabilities they need to do this by their own account, which is why, if you remember, there was a plan to do it in multiple phases.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very clear in his will to completely root out Hezbollah. And I may remind our viewers that Hezbollah is not only a military faction, it's also a political and social movement that is deeply rooted in Lebanon. Do you think that Israel can root out Hezbollah?
The military side of Hezbollah has now been declared illegal by our government. The political and Prime Minister did say that if Hezbollah was to date purely as a political party, then he would have no problem with it.
But I understand the Lebanese authorities can live with Hezbollah being a political social movement, but Israel is increasingly showing signs that it cannot. And Hezbollah is an ideology. How can you defeat an ideology?
The way forward is to show what the state can do, deliver, basic goods and services, on all fronts, health, social, education, etc. But for the state to be able to deliver this, it needs financial, needs political willingness, which I think it has, but it also needs financial means. And unfortunately, the Hezbollah dragging us again back into the war, it makes the availability of international funding that much more difficult and distant in time.
Do you think if the Iranian regime was completely defeated, that would significantly weaken Hezbollah as a movement, as an ideology, as a popular movement in Lebanon?
The lifeline, there is a financial lifeline for Hezbollah coming from Iran. They've said it so publicly. There is a military one, probably that has severely decreased since the regime change in Syria, but certainly on the financial front as well. And so any reduction, any major reduction in both on the military side and the financial side, in terms of lifeline to Hezbollah, certainly would weaken it.
And with the situation in the Middle East getting worse and thousands now internally displaced, with some stadiums even turned into shelters, the EU Agency for Asylum is preparing for potential humanitarian crisis. Our Jakubianis reports.
War. War never changes. But while the news cycle obsesses over tactical maps, your reporter is looking at the people. President Trump has called the conflict
a short-term excursion.
But if he's wrong, Europe could deal with a refugee crisis of an unprecedented magnitude. And history shows that when a home becomes a battlefield, people move towards safety and existing ties. So where could they go? Currently, roughly 4 million Iranians live abroad, and most of them migrated during or after the 1979 revolution. In Europe, Germany leads with over 300,000 people, followed by the UK and Sweden, with each hosting around 100,000. In 2025, only 8,000 Iranians sought asylum in Europe, which is less than 1% of all applications. But with a population of 90 million, the EU Asylum Agency warns that even partial instability could trigger a massive refugee crisis. However, the agency also calls this scenario highly speculative, stressing it is too early for firm predictions. But you should know this isn't only about Iran, it is about the whole region. Iran is already one of the world's largest refugee hosts, a home to over 1.5 million of them and many more with an undocumented status. Most of refugees come from Afghanistan and Iraq and are now caught in just another war zone. And the ripple effect is spreading. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 660,000 people have been displaced in Lebanon because of the conflict. And right now, no one knows yet how or when the war will end. But for Europe, it seems that the consequences are no longer distant.
And it is in this very context that MEPs are gathering in Strasbourg this week. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is set to address the Parliament this morning. For more on that, we can now cross over to the European Parliament in Strasbourg and bring in Euronews' Marit Gwynne-Jones. Good morning, Marit. So Ursula von der Leyen will take centre stage today at a very tense time for the European Union and also for interinstitutional relations. Tell us more.
Yes, Maeve, expect a fiery debate when the Commission President joins the hemicycle later this morning. For two reasons, really, because firstly, members of this Parliament have been telling me in recent days that they feel that von der Leyen has been really overstepping her mandate in response to the conflict in the Middle East, that she's been wading into foreign policy when she shouldn't, encroaching on the role of the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas. I remember von der Leyen was the compromise candidate back in 2019, but her critics say that since then she's been using crises like this one to accumulate power and to expand her mandate into a more geopolitical one. And in fact, von der Leyen did deliver a speech earlier this week where she essentially laid out a new vision for the way the EU conducts its foreign policy, saying it has to stop being a custodian of the old world order, she said, and that it essentially faces two choices. It either clings on, she said, to what used to make it strong, or it adapts to a more power politics world by pursuing a more interest-based foreign policy. We've had quite a harsh response from socialist voices. The European Council President, Antonio Costa, Costa, saying yesterday that EU still needs to be a standard bearer. Also, the Vice President of the Commission, Teresa Ribera, another socialist voice, saying yesterday in response to von der Leyen's speech, she said it was not the most adequate manner to express herself, but yes, she is fully committed, of course, to the international order. We've also seen a response from the Spanish government saying that the EU has to uphold the rules-based order. So, Maeve, I think we can expect these tensions to really play out when von der Leyen addresses the hemicycle this morning.
Indeed. Mary Gwynne-Jones, thank you so much for that live update there from Strasbourg. But that does bring this edition of Europe Today to an end. For more news and analysis, do visit euronews.com. Thank you so much, though, for tuning in. As always, take care and see you very soon on Euronews.